Alright, welcome back after our lengthy video hiatus. This video is going to cover the Cold War, and specifically we're going to be looking at the beginnings of the Cold War up to about 1950. There will be a second video on the extension of the Cold War after that, but really what we're looking at here is the immediate years after World War II. How did the Cold War get started? So let's go ahead and get into it. Alright, so first of all, let's talk about what was the Cold War. The Cold War was the political and ideological conflict that existed between the United States and the Soviet Union. It lasted roughly 45 years, from 1945 to 1991. And one of the characteristics of the Cold War is each of our two countries tried to influence the rest of the world. We tried to get each nation in the world to basically pick sides, and we divided the world between our friends, our allies, their friends, their allies. And a lot of times we would talk about the world map during the Cold War being countries that were either blue or red. So here you have an example of that. The blue countries are, of course, us and our friends. The red countries were the Soviet Union and their friends and their allies. And now, one of the reasons we call it a Cold War is because we never actually fought each other. We understand the concept of war. You're fighting someone. We never actually militarily went to war with the Soviet Union. What did happen, though, is we would get into conflicts with each other's allies. So we never fought each other, but we would fight their friends, or they would fight our friends. Or sometimes we would get our friends and their friends to fight, and we would support the two different sides. These are called proxy wars. They look like they're taking place somewhere else and they involve somebody else, but really what it is, it's the two other countries, the two superpowers, as we would refer to ourselves, manipulating and assisting and trying to help the other side win the war. So what were the causes? We'll try to run through these kind of quickly because there are a lot of them. First, we have different political beliefs between us and the Soviet Union. To start off with, they wanted to advance the cause of communism around the world, of course. Their government was a totalitarian government, or an authoritarian government. The government had pretty much full control over the economy, the people, everything. Now, of course, in the United States, we wanted to advance capitalism, and of course, our government is more responsive to the people and more willing to allow people their individual freedoms. There's also a case of mutual distrust between us and the Soviet Union. We see each other. We see what each other country does as being aggressive. And it's not just us seeing the Soviet Union that way. They saw it that way too when we did things. They viewed it as the United States being aggressive. And what's really unnerving about it is both sides went into with this idea of distrust, and then everything the other side did kind of confirmed that yes, they were not to be trusted. Even when either side does something that is really innocuous. There were also national security concerns. After World War II, the Soviet Union, one of their national security concerns was they wanted what we refer to as buffer states between them and the West, Western Europe and the United States. Stalin phrased it this way, essentially, this is a paraphrase, but essentially he said, look, my country's been attacked twice in the last 30 years by the West. I want people between me and them that are on my side. The United States, of course, we wanted free countries that were capitalist, and I put that free in quotation marks because another characteristic of the Cold War from our point of view is if you were on our side and you weren't allied with the Soviet Union, we didn't necessarily care if you were a democracy. Well, we will have several friends that are dictators, but they're not communists, so at least they're a dictator that's on our side. Now, some of the things from our point of view that helped lead to the Cold War, all those things previously helped lead to the Cold War, but they were on both sides. These are specifically ours. One of the things we believed was that the Soviet Union wanted to take over the world. Now, they did want to advance the cause of communism, but they didn't necessarily want to take over each country and make them part of the Soviet Union. We also believed that communism was monolithic. What that means is we believed no communist activity happened anywhere in the world without direction and orders from the Soviet Union. All communists were directed from Moscow, we believed. No one out there is thinking communism on their own. We also believed in something called domino theory. Now, when we get to the Vietnam War, we'll talk. The Vietnam War is a wonderful example of domino theory and why we got into it. But we believe this as early as 1945. Domino theory is very simple. If one country falls to communism, then its neighbor will fall to communism. And then that country's neighbor will fall to communism, and so on and so on. And like I said, we talk about this a lot with the Vietnam War and why we got involved there. But if you imagine stacking dominoes up and writing the names of countries on, like we have here in this illustration, all it takes to make them all fall is to start the first one. So with domino theory, one of the things is you have to stop that first country from falling to communism. So at the end of World War II, here's what starts to happen. The Soviet Union took over Eastern Europe. That was those buffer states that they wanted here between them and the West. Okay, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania. Yugoslavia also is a communist country, but they were not allied with the Soviet Union. Okay? And they set up communist governments, and anyone who disagreed with that, I mean, they start gulags, they start political prisoners, many people were executed. Now, the thing about this is FDR had, and I put this in quotation marks, he agreed to allowing the Soviet Union to take over Eastern Europe at the Yalta Conference. FDR understood Stalin's concern and his basically paranoia over the idea of the West having invaded the Soviet Union. So FDR thought he had a good enough relationship with Stalin that he could allow him to take over Eastern Europe and then convince Stalin that the West did not want to invade and calm Stalin down and allow free elections to take place in these countries. Unfortunately for those countries, FDR died in April of 1945. So by the time you get to July of 1945, you have another conference at the end of World War II, which we talked about in the World War II notes. The Potsdam Conference. FDR is gone. Churchill is gone. This man right here is Clement Attlee. He replaced Churchill as prime minister after World War II. We don't care about him. The only people we care about at the Potsdam Conference are Truman and Joseph Stalin. And they argue at the Potsdam Conference. They don't trust each other. Truman believes that Stalin wants to take over the world, and what does he see? He sees the Red Army moving into Eastern Europe, taking over, setting up more communist dictatorships. Stalin doesn't trust Truman. Stalin felt that Truman bullied him. In fact, at the Potsdam while Truman's at the Potsdam Conference, we test our first atomic bomb. And Truman and Stalin had been arguing, and neither one was giving in, and there was some question as to whether or not Truman was going to be forced to have to compromise with Stalin, when all of a sudden Truman got the secret message that, hey, we have a working atomic bomb. And he used that to kind of force Joseph Stalin to see his way. And so Stalin felt that Truman had bullied him. Then, of course, in August of 1945, we used the atomic bombs. Part of the reason why was to intimidate the Soviet Union. Look what we can do. Aren't you glad we're not using this on your country? So all that goes on in that year, well, not even the year, but in the couple of months at the end of World War II. Now, to fight the Cold War, our plan to stop the Soviet Union is called containment. Containment is going to allow communism to exist where it already is. So the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, communism is going to exist there. But we call it containment because we're going to work on not allowing it to spread. We're going to keep it where it is. Because eventually, communism will run itself into the ground. It is not something that is economically or even politically sustainable. And so as long as you keep it from spreading, it will eventually collapse. This policy was based on the ideas of this man. His name is George Kennan. George Kennan was an expert on the Soviet Union and Russia in the State Department. And so he had spent his career studying not only Russian politics, but the Russian people and the Soviet Union and how they operated and what they believed. And he wrote something called the Long Telegram. Y'all, in theory, are familiar with the telegram. It's the dots and the dashes that go. They're usually really short. This one, we call it the Long Telegram because it was 8,000 words. But what it did was he explained how the Soviets thought, why they did what they did, and how they could be stopped. Okay? Essentially, what he said was the Soviet Union will act tough, but they will back down when challenged. That everything they do is for show. They want people to think that they are powerful, but in reality they're not, and they know it. And so therefore, if you oppose them, if you stand up to them, they will back down. And so what he said was anytime the Soviet Union attempts to do something, the United States needs to apply counter pressure. We just need to push back in whatever way and wherever they're applying the initial pressure. Now, the thing about Kennan is he did not mean that it had to be military in nature. Kennan thought that counter pressure could take many different forms. Unfortunately for the Cold War, the thinkers in Washington are going to associate it mostly with military action. And so that'll explain a lot of the stuff that we do during the Cold War, why it had to be military. So, the opening of hostilities in the 40s actually starts with Turkey. Okay? Turkey, as you notice on our map here, borders the Mediterranean, but it also borders the Black Sea. And out here is the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union has a huge military naval base here in Crimea. And the Soviets threatened Turkey. And what they wanted is they wanted access to the Mediterranean. This right here, the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, if you remember from world history, this was the route from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. It's very narrow, and Turkey occupies both sides. And so the Soviet Union wanted access through here, and they wanted free access. And they threatened Turkey with military force if Turkey didn't give them free access to the Mediterranean. At the same time they're doing this, they're also backing a communist revolution in Greece. After World War II, the Nazis, as they had fled Greece and the Greek militias had helped drive them out, there was a minority revolution. The estimates are 10% of the people in Greece supported the communist revolution. But the Soviets were giving them aid. They were giving them equipment, they were giving them money, and so they were carrying out a successful revolution. And there was a fear that the Greek people were just going to kind of say, look, we're tired of war. Sure, you seem like you want to be in charge. Go right ahead. So as the Soviet Union is threatening Turkey and Greece, Truman goes to Congress and announces what comes to be known as the Truman Doctrine. Essentially what Truman says is the United States will fight communism anytime, anywhere. And that is going to be another part of the basis for our Cold War policies and decision-making, that we will stop communism wherever it tries to expand. And so what this meant was the United States would send military and monetary aid to Greece, to the Greek government, to stop that communist revolution. The United States Navy parked off the coast of Turkey and essentially said, if the Soviet Union attacks Turkey, we will defend Turkey. And what happened? The Soviet Union backed down. Just like George Kennan thought they would. They backed down when they were opposed. Now there is another element to what the United States does in Europe after World War II. There's something called the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was billions upon billions of dollars in aid to help Europe rebuild after World War II. See, in all the countries in Europe, not just Eastern Europe, but also Western Europe, there were communist movements. They blamed World War II on capitalism and said, look, it's not being fixed. Everything is in total ruins. If you will support us, we will fix it. And there was a fear that if the governments in Western Europe couldn't rebuild fast enough, that people would turn to communism. And so all this money is given to Western Europe to help them rebuild. And sure enough, within 10 years, Western Europe was rebuilt in terms of their economy. It not only recovered from World War II, but it had grown to a point where it would have been had World War II not destroyed their economies. It was as if economically World War II had never happened. This money actually was also available to the countries of Eastern Europe, but because they had been taken over by communists and they were influenced by the Soviet Union, they rejected that aid. Now, things the United States did in response to the start of the Cold War, there's something called the National Security Act that Congress created where they kind of reorganized some of the government. They created the Defense Department, rolling all the branches of the military into one. They also created the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, to gather intelligence and spy on our enemies. And then they created something called the National Security Council. The National Security Council is set up to advise the president on matters dealing with national security. Shortly after its formation, the National Security Council started writing documents and reports. One of them is called NSC 68. It's one of the more important documents from the Cold War because it made recommendations to the government of what we needed to do in order to effectively fight the Cold War. One of those things was the National Security Council recommended increasing defense spending by 4 times what it was in the aftermath of World War II. And so this is going to be a huge increase. They also recommended that the United States maintain a 3.5 million man military. Okay? That's not just the Army, but also the Navy, the Air Force, everything. Okay? So these are huge, huge recommendations. Partly because of the recommendations of NSC 68, Congress would also pass in 1948 something called the Selective Service Act of 1948. If you remember from previous lectures, the Selective Service, that is the draft. The draft that was created in 1948 establishes a peacetime draft. A peacetime draft that would last through the early decades of the Cold War, through the 1960s and 70s. Okay? The whole purpose of it was to keep the military at 2 million men. And I just love this photograph because here we have a young Elvis Presley in his U.S. Army uniform. And we think, oh, somebody dug this out of his closet, after he became a star. And look, he was in the army too. He was drafted into the military after he started to become popular. And he put his career on hold for 2 years to go serve in the military. So there's some trivia about Elvis. Now, in Germany, as we advance further into the first couple of years after the Cold War started, after World War II, Germany was split into the 4 zones of occupation, if you remember from those World War II notes. You have the British zone, the American zone, the French zone, and the Soviet zone. Okay? Britain, France, the United States, we all set up very similar government structures. The whole point of the occupation was to just let Germany know they had been beaten and to administer them, but eventually the plan was to reunify the country under one government. And so the 3 of us, we set up a very similar government structure. That way, when it did reunify, it'd be there would be a very simple transition. Now, the Soviet Union, of course, set up a communist government in their zone of occupation. The plan for Germany was eventually we would allow the people to vote and ask them basically, which government do you want to live under? Now, because most of the German people are living over here in this western zone that has this kind of government, theoretically that government is going to win. In fact, it probably on the balance would have, especially when you consider that the Germans that were over here in the Soviet zone start leaving. They start trying to get to the other zones. Recognizing this, the Soviets would first shut this border so that you couldn't walk directly across. But what the Germans started doing is they started going into Berlin. Okay? That's the one city over here that has, maybe you notice the different colors. Here it is on this side. Because Berlin was also split up into 4 zones. And getting from East Berlin to West Berlin was much simpler. And so the Soviet Union, by 1948, had gotten angry that so many of these Germans were fleeing their zone. In March of 1948, the British, French, and Americans are ready to hold the elections, and the Soviet Union doesn't want to because they know that they would lose. And so rather than wait on those elections to happen, we went ahead and merged our zones, creating what became known as West Germany. Now, because of that, the Soviet Union decided to start the Berlin blockade because they still had the problem of the people going to Berlin and escaping into the West. Their goal with the Berlin blockade was to force West Berlin to surrender. Their blockade was very simple. They didn't allow anyone in. They didn't allow any supplies in. And so the people of West Berlin are faced with the prospects of either surrendering or starving to death. President Truman responded to this act of aggression with something we call the Berlin Airlift. Rather than go in and attempt to fight our way through and potentially start a world war, another world war, instead what we did is we recalled a bunch of the Army Air Force pilots and we flew supplies from West Germany to West Berlin to keep the city from surrendering. Because that was one thing the Soviets couldn't blockade. They couldn't stop the planes. The only way to stop the plane would have been to shoot it down. And if the Soviet Union had shot down one of the planes, it would have been easy to say this was them starting a new war. The Berlin Airlift worked incredibly well. At the beginning, in June of 1948, the people of West Berlin had to go on rations to make sure that there was enough food left for everybody. By the time the Soviet Union backed down in May of 1949, there were no rations in West Berlin. Everyone was able to get plenty and anything they wanted. So the Soviet Union had to stop and had to relinquish that Berlin blockade. They then did turn around, though, and create East Germany. And so Germany, remained split between East and West for the remainder of the Cold War, and you still had West Berlin over here in the middle of East Germany. That'll be important in the coming weeks as we talk about other aspects of the Cold War. Now, from the United States' point of view, we did have some failures in the Cold War. One of them, a big one, was the Communist Revolution in China. In 1949, the Communists take over China. This was the end of a civil war that had been going on for decades. The Communist Chinese were led by this man, Mao Zedong. And they had been fighting against a group of people called the Nationalists, who were led by a man named Chiang Kai-shek, or depending on what textbook you read, Zhang Jixi. Maybe you remember him from world history. The Nationalists, during this civil war, they had been in charge of China. They were the ones that had originally overthrown the Chinese emperor many, many decades before. And because they were not communist, the United States backed them. Unfortunately for the United States, the Nationalists were, many of their top leaders were corrupt, and they stole some of the aid, and they were mismanaged, and they kind of brutalized the people rather than Mao and the communists, who tried to take care of the people in theory and recruited the common people to their cause. And so as early as 1946, people in the U.S. government believed we were backing the wrong side in this communist revolution, that the nationalists would eventually lose, but we kept supporting them anyway because they were not communist. Okay? The nationalists, after they lost, fled to Taiwan and took control there, leading the United States to recognize Taiwan as an independent country. In August of 1949, another big failure for us in the Cold War was the Soviet Union tested their own atomic bomb. For 4 years, we had had supremacy in atomic weapons, and we were able to always hold that over the Soviet Union's head as, well, look what we can do to you. Well, now all of a sudden the Soviet Union says, whatever you can do to us, we can do to you also. That started a race then to create something called the hydrogen bomb. And within a couple of years, we had developed the hydrogen bomb. Hydrogen bomb is, just in terms of scale, just massively bigger than the atomic bomb. It can do so much more damage and destruction. And so now we all of a sudden had the hydrogen bomb, and we told the world, look at what we can do. And within a year, the Soviet Union had their own as well. And so this led to this huge nuclear arms race. Who can build a bigger, better, more destructive bomb? Okay? And we would test these things, and we'd show them on TV, showing not only the world, but also the other side. Look what we can do to you at the press of a button. So that's how the Cold War got started. I hope it made a lot of sense. Even though the Cold War itself may not make a lot of sense to you. We'll finish the Cold War up, or at least the opening years of the Cold War, with the next video.